homeboy. Aaron, open your mind. Drink.
Very excited to have her back. Her new book, One Nation Under Blackmail, has been crushing it. We're honored to have her back on our little show. Please welcome Whitney Webb. How are you, Whitney?
Hey, doing great. Great to be here.
Well, we're honored to have you on. I've been seeing you doing all the amazing shows, and it's great to see you getting your love from everybody for your research and all that stuff. And let's just pretend like people might not know who you are. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where our listeners can find you?
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing writing, researching stuff pretty much full time since 2016. I guess some people think I came out of nowhere just a few months ago because I had a pretty big interview, but I've actually been doing this for a pretty long time. So I've actually used to work for Mint Press News. In 2019, I did a pretty successful series on the Epstein case, which has grown into the book that I had come out at the end of last year, One Nation Under Blackmail. And I have my own site now called Unlimited Hangout. And before then and still now, I contribute to The Last American Vagabond with Ryan Christian.
Well, we love Ryan
on occasion. So you can find me there as well. And
you're on Rockfin with a very successful show on Rockfin. And so, Whitney, let's get into it because we have a short amount of time. So I'm always, in conversations with, I guess we'll call them normies, whatever we want to call them, that they still believe the mainstream media and all that stuff. And, inevitably I'll be like, what they want. And then they'll go, who is they? Who's they? And which I think they want me to say the Jews, but I don't think it's, that's their kind of move to kind of emotionally just attack my argument and not have any real discussion. But I think it's beyond that. I think it's at higher levels. So when I want to ask you, if I say who is they, in your opinion, who is they?
All right. So I might have a different answer to this question than maybe you're hoping for. Sorry about that. But basically, I think very few people, if any, at least in the alt media space, know for 100% who they would be. Right. So a lot of the groups or people that we can look at and pinpoint as being obviously shady and obviously a part of it, I don't see those people being at the top, right? I mean, even people like Bill Gates, right? I don't see him being at the top of all. And, a lot of these tech billionaires who we're told, right, are the richest people in the world and the most powerful people in the world. Like Elon Musk, for example, he's a really good example. He's supposed to be the world's richest guy, right? The only reason he's rich is because he's had his business empire basically supported by a bunch of government subsidies. So if you're getting a bunch of subsidies from the deep state, right, and you're contracting with the deep state, the military and the intelligence communities, which Elon Musk does through SpaceX, and I think some other companies as well. You didn't just get to the top and you're not, there's people that supported your rise to that top. You were put into that position. So you're not the guy at the top, right? And so I think people like Bill Gates fall in that category too. And so, in answering this question, I kind of want to defer to a graphic that a colleague of mine, Ian Davis, made of what he calls it the global public-private partnership, trying to sort of chart out how power works today. And public-private partnership should be pretty familiar to people at this point because of how the World Economic Forum, for example, likes to throw it around and stuff like that. But basically, he structures it so the Bank of International Settlements is at the top. And I think, at least as far as we can see, that's pretty fair, right? Because that's the central bank of central banks. So they basically control the money, right? So who controls the BIS? Well, I don't actually know that, right? But there's there's people that have written books about it, like the Tower of Babel, for example, and some other books on the topic that go back and talk about how the BIS sort of came out of weird stuff in World War II about like laundering, gold theft, and all of this stuff. So, I mean, you can assume that it's ultimately bankers at the end of the day that are on top, but which bankers? And again, a lot of those bankers work for some of these elite families. And even if you want to look at groups like the CIA, for example, if you go back to the origins of the CIA, you have a lot of involvement from British intelligence and the British aristocracy, and also oligarch families, family factions, like in the United States, like the Rockefellers, for example, are a well-known one. But you have the Morgans, like J.P. Morgan, and the Mellons, and like a lot of these other aristocratic families in the mix. So I don't know. I mean, if you want to talk about who's on the top, I think a lot of these people marched out in front of us are sort of more managerial people, or people that, have the people at the top telling them what to do, and then they go out there and sort of get tied up with a lot of these policies or different actions and activities that make them notorious with people that are calling out the system as it's currently being developed, right? But if you want to look at where the heart of power is, yeah, I mean, it's probably going to be the people who control the money supply at the end of the day. And it's hard to know exactly, like, it's this guy, that guy, and this family. I mean, there's obviously families that are part of it and in the upper tiers, but we can't know who's on top necessarily at any given time. And I would also argue there's a lot of factional infighting among people. Yeah. You have some, prominent factions of the global elite, right? They don't agree on everything. They might agree on the end goals of a lot of it, but I don't think they necessarily agree on like who gets what and who gets to control what. I mean, I think there's a lot of fights over the spoils, right? Sort of like predators fighting over a carcass or something, I mean, a lot of these guys are play pretty dirty even with each other, even though they could be on the same side a lot of the time. So it becomes kind of complicated when you're trying to map like the global elite, which is, like, or where power really lies. But I think, anyone that buys into the argument that, it's the national leaders of national governments are the top of the global power structure. I mean, I think that's totally divorced from reality at this point. I mean, if you think Joe Biden's like the guy ultimately in charge of the U.S. right now, I think I don't know. I definitely don't agree with that. And I think it's pretty clear that he's, even presidents before Biden, they're pretty much there just to
demoralize.
Sorry. They're pretty much there to sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
Random.
But we're talking basically about how presidents are basically just puppets and actors. And I think you're totally right. I mean, every part of Elon Musk's story is like almost made up. What he's doing. And I just think that people are so desperate for someone to come and save them that we kind of fall in love with these people, whether it's Elon, whether it's Trump, I mean, Obama. I mean, you just go down and look at the hope. And like at the end of the day, there's an old saying that if you know their names, they don't run anything. And I think that's a really smart.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. So I would put people like Bill Gates, for example, who gets and even people like Klaus Schwab, a lot of the boogeymen that people sort of like outwardly, at least these days, sort of point as being on the top. Those guys are there to basically connect policies developed by groups like the CFR, the World Economic Forum, and all of these guys down to governments. And national governments only exist today to basically create in what the UN and the WEF and these groups call enabling environments. So basically, it's a national government's job to implement these policies that are coming from these people, essentially. So like the World Economic Forum will do that through the Young Global Leaders program, or by cultivating politicians in certain countries and hand them these ready-made policies to implement. And that's how you get different countries around the world with ostensibly different governments all implementing the same policies, whether it's COVID or things like Build Back Better, for example, and things like that. They're all getting the policies from these same group of think tanks and other organizations, a lot of which are sort of out of that round table model, right? Like the CFR, Chatham House, and a lot of them are interconnected at the end of the day. And so people like Bill Gates, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the World Economic Forum, are basically connecting those policies developed by and for the benefit of oligarchs and the global elite to national governments. And the national governments enforce those policies upon the rest of us. And we're at the bottom of the pyramid, basically.
So, we're going to get into a little spirituality a little later in the show towards the end. But, when you look at these policies, you go, okay, because the average person thinks this is about money and this is about power, but they have all the money. Like you said, they control the money and they have all the power. Do you think there's any kind of like, this might be wading in some weirdness, but for me, there's some kind of occult rituals into what's going on, like what's really behind depopulation? Is there some dark arts? Have you, in your research, have you waded into those waters at all?
So I don't really, in my research, wade into the occult stuff so much. But when it comes to depopulation, I mean, it's really clear that there's a straight line from the eugenics, the development of eugenics in the late 19th century, all the way to policies to today. And basically what we've seen with COVID-19 and since is an effort to frame eugenics as healthcare. And a lot of, eugenics has developed over time, as I've noted a few times in past interviews and articles. After World War II, there was an effort to rebrand eugenics as transhumanism. Because Julian Huxley, who was the first guy to lead UNESCO, was also head of the British Eugenics Society. And so when he was charting out his vision for UNESCO and like the launch speech for it, basically, he said, we have to make the unthinkable thinkable again about eugenics. And then 10 years later, he says that the new eugenics is transhumanism. The merging of man with machine is how the human race is going to be perfected. And obviously, there's so much transhumanism discourse today, that ideology still exists and hasn't gone away. And ultimately, part of that has to do with, I think, the global elite viewing themselves as so superior that they view themselves essentially as a separate species. And you have people like H.G. Wells, for example, who's a well-known science fiction writer from the early eugenics period of the development of eugenics. And he was also an avowed eugenicist, and I think a Fabian, if I'm not mistaken. And he essentially said, over 100 years ago, that there was going to be sort of a splitting of the human race, and there would be like the elite and then the squat working underclass that like eats bugs, right? And they're there'll be separate species at some point. It's not just an economic difference anymore. It'll become a biological difference. And there's efforts, other people in the years since and even today who talk about that still happening. And you can sort of see how it's starting to sort of come out in the open in some sense, in some senses, the eat bugs stuff, H.G. Wells talking about that 100 years ago for the working class is pretty freaky now that the bug stuff is getting pushed all over the place, and obviously the elites aren't going to be eating that stuff. It's for everyone else. And all this genetic engineering and all that stuff, the move into all these crazy technologies that can alter human beings, adults in vivo. Yeah, I mean, they want to get into all this stuff for a bunch of crazy reasons, I think. But if, ultimately, what is this about? I would say that what really bugs them is that they see everything the non-ruling class does as leading to what they view as chaos, right? And so they want to bring order to that chaos, right? And they want to have everything controlled because, if you look at the control systems they're building today, it's not just about surveilling you and knowing what you're doing right now. It's about using predictive AI algorithms to decide, to be able to know what you will do in the future, right? It's all about predicting so they can control stuff before it happens and manage things before it happens. It's ultimately, at the end of the day, I would argue, pretty much all about control. And so they want to stop this chaos that they see coming from the lesser classes, the underclasses. They just want to eliminate it. And so ultimately, what is that chaos they're referring to? Well, a lot of it is, things like, revolution, things like that, but also like human creativity, spontaneity, and things of that nature. A lot of things that, we see as being integral parts of humanity, right? That like creative spark, these ruling classes don't really have that. They see it as being chaos, and they want to eliminate that chaos. And so if you remember, I don't know if you're familiar, Sam, but there's like a book that was just like 1984 and Brave New World before either of those books existed. I think a couple decades prior. It's called We by a Russian guy named Yevgeny Zamyatin, who is not nearly as remembered as, Huxley and Orwell. And I think with good reason. And basically, spoiler alert, but the book is essentially about how the state, the one state, it's called in the book, realizes that the only way they can control human beings indefinitely is to remove the imagination from the human brain. And so they basically subject everyone to like mandatory brain surgery, and they take the part of the brain that is capable of producing that creative spark and that imagination out. So no one, they're basically automatons and human robots. And I think that's where a lot of this is looking to go at the end of the day.
That's some Jeffrey
because
Dahmer
look what they're
shit.
Trying to turn us into, right?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Like, if you watch stuff happening in real time, like the chaos you're talking about, it's very interesting because if you take YouTube, right? YouTube was built out the back of conspiracy theorists. Like they were putting out these amazing movies that everybody was flocking to. And now, like we have friends of ours who don't even do anything really political, like the Legion of Skanks guys, that whole comedy network. They just lost their YouTube channel because they were getting so big and they were putting out such great quality that, again, that's the chaos they're talking about. Like they didn't need banker money. They weren't, corporate, and that scares them. Like it really scares the elites when they can't compete and they can't control the message and they can't control the propaganda. So YouTube ends up basically cutting its nose despite its face to destroy its own traffic. We're seeing it happen right now in real time where everything's down, but they don't care because through this system of, the Federal Reserve where whoever owns Google is going to lose some money. But guess what? Here's these bailouts that clean up that red tape and keep them afloat. So it's like this weird kind of thing where they're destroying their own brand and they don't really care because they'd rather have a destroyed brand than chaos.
Yeah, something like that. And you can replicate that kind of example with a lot of other things besides YouTube, right? I mean, they just, I think ultimately anything they feel like is too unwieldy for them or could lead to them, complications for them in the future, their grip on power and things like that. They don't want to deal with it. And so they're trying to create a system now where they'll never have to worry about dealing with that stuff again. Right. Because if you can control what everyone's doing and you can predict and know what they're going to do before they do it, and have it all managed by AI and all this stuff, you don't really have to worry. And if you put brain chips in everyone so they can't be creative and they can't ever cognitively rebel against their masters again, that's basically what this is leading us to.
And they can just make shit up like, oh, he's going to steal something in the future.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what they're really worried about. Deep fakes are about is just creating fake evidence to just kind of cripple people who might have opposite opinions.
Used to be dropping drugs on people. Now imagine if you could just make an entire fake, back catalog of videos that you've been circulating.
100%. So, you mentioned somehow everything's connected. In my humble opinion, and what do I know? But, CIA, Mossad, MI6, I believe it is, like they all appear as separate entities. But in my opinion, they're all really connected and they just have different brand
they work
names.
together a lot. Like, look at one of the biggest scandals for the CIA in their history Iran-Contra. That was the CIA, it was Mossad, and then you have like hints of British intelligence involvement with people like Margaret Thatcher's son, and like all sorts of crazy stuff in the mix. And you know, honestly, there's a lot of overlap. Like I mentioned earlier, the CIA was it from its, you know, well, its precursor, the OSS, had a lot of British influence and involvement. It actually had a British member, Ivor Bryce, and I mean, you see it, you know, also in the beginning of the State of Israel as well, the involvement of like the British military sort of helping the Haganah and some of the, you know, the Zionist militias and all of that, and paramilitary groups. I mean, you can't really divorce one from the other in a lot of things. But I don't know if that's necessarily true now. I mean, there's a lot of really crazy stuff going on in geopolitics. So it's kind of hard to be like, you know, this is what the team, you know, everyone's on this team. You know, each of these intelligence agencies have their own factions. But there's over the years been an extensive amount of collaboration. And ultimately, you know, what my conclusion is that most of the power, like I talk about in my book, for example, like that particular power structure that was around Epstein, it's 100% transnational. You can't isolate that, you know, just to Israeli intelligence or just to U.S. intelligence or British intelligence or whatever. He basically entered this swamp which was something that, you know, Robert Maxwell was in as well, that involved a lot of, you know, British stuff, a lot of Saudi stuff, a lot of Israeli stuff, and obviously a bunch of stuff in the U.S. So, you know, these guys collaborate a lot. And if you look at a group like Saudi Arabia, right, you know, they've been controlled by Britain and the U.S. For well over 100 years. And Saudi intelligence doesn't do anything without one of those two intelligence agencies basically signing off on it. So that's why it's funny when people, you know, will only acknowledge, you know, like the 28 pages, like the Saudi involvement in 9/11. Yeah. But obviously, if Saudi intelligence was involved in 9/11, the CIA would have known about it. 100%.
And for sure, Mossad. I mean, you're just interviewing.
Yeah, totally.
You see those dancing Israelis doing television interviews, which is so crazy.
Yeah, they were there to document the event because that's totally normal.
Imagine that on Arsenio Hall, like him interviewing like Timothy McVeigh about the big day in OKC. It's like that's what that was. Like, how crazy is that idea? And then when you just talk about that, and this is where I think a lot of stuff gets in, where it's like this notion that anybody of your religion or your belief could possibly do anything wrong is like an affront to you, and obviously some kind of bigotry is just laughable. In the long run, it's just going to cause more and more chaos, more and more. And like Epstein, it's like to sit there and say it's a Mossad thing, to say it's not is ridiculous. And we had more and more people in these limited hangouts try to convince us that it wasn't them, when it was 100% them. They were running a blackmail scheme. And it's just like, it's kind of crazy because we see it happen all the time. Well, the FBI and they have consistently protected child sex trafficking organizations and operations all the time. So real quick, can you get into your book for us? I know you've done a couple shows and talked about, but I'm really excited to hear about it. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, so the book started off, like I mentioned earlier, as like my original series I did for Mint Press on Jeffrey Epstein, but a lot of it, so like it's 2 volumes. So volume 1 is all the stuff before Epstein. Volume 2 is all the Epstein stuff. So basically what I'm trying to do in volume 1 is show you how this group that Epstein eventually stepped into and became a part of, like where they come from and how they developed and what they did before Epstein got involved. And one of the reasons I did that is because if you want to talk about Epstein and intelligence connections, like what he was doing in the 1980s, you have to have a pretty decent working knowledge of things like Iran-Contra, for example. And most Americans can't tell you what that was actually about. Or, you know, a lot of other events. So anyway, volume 1's sort of like a prequel, I would say, about stuff you need to kind of understand about how this whole system works and how that particular group that Epstein was working with works in order to really understand Epstein. But, you know, in the interest of time, volume 2 is about not just Epstein, it's also about Leslie Wexner and Ghislaine Maxwell and why she was, sent to the U.S. By her father before her father died in 1991. I talk about Robert Maxwell in both volumes, by the way. And then I get into a lot of really crazy stuff related to Epstein and his visits to the White House. And this Mark Middleton character who was in the news lately because, he died last year with an extension cord around his neck and a shotgun wound to the chest. And it was ruled a suicide. So he somehow managed to shoot himself in the chest and hang himself at the same time last year.
That was him.
So,
wow.
Yeah, so this is the guy that signed off on most of Epstein's visits. So when the Daily Mail reported this, for example, they said, Middleton signed him in 7 times. But what they didn't tell you is that he was signed in by like people working for Middleton more times to meet with Middleton. So saying it was just 7 visits is not fair. And it was 17 total visits by Epstein to the White House that we know about, right? Because there's also people on like the White House logs from the Clinton era signing into the White House as like Donald Duck, right? So, I mean, there were people that were coming in that didn't want to actually write down who they were, so for whatever reason.
So, I mean, I'm just gonna be honest with you, and this could sound like knuckle dragger stuff, but I honestly believe that they used Ghislaine Maxwell because she was the most attractive of her sisters. She was very attractive. Oh, yeah. And the other ones, like,
much more than the twins, yeah.
For sure. And it's like the same reason why when we go back to Barack Obama and his mother and the fact that George Bush Sr. and Barack Obama's grandfather basically were very instrumental in basically rebranding the CIA from the OSS. And like Barack Obama's grandpa used his daughter as an MK Ultra sexkin. So they're not afraid to use their children in ways that most people would be horrified. Like this is kind of the mentality that they have.
I think that is super true with the case of Robert Maxwell. To me, Robert Maxwell was 100% a narcissist, in addition to being an intelligence asset and a shady businessman and all this other stuff he was. And in my opinion, he saw his children as extensions of himself, which is actually really common with, narcissist parents. To not see their children as individuals, but as extensions of them. And so Ghislaine Maxwell, because she was the favorite child, right? Robert Maxwell saw him, and he said it numerous times, right, as Ghislaine as being just like him. And so he was trying to get basically set up a new headquarters in Manhattan. He wanted to basically become a major name in New York and sort of move his base of operations from Britain to New York. And so this was happening in 1990 or so. And he sent Ghislaine over to sort of be the emissary for that. But according to her siblings, Ghislaine originally came earlier to Los Angeles first and was going to be in some film, but they won't say what the movie was. And then after that, she apparently went to New York and then, acting as the emissary of her father's business interests there. And the business foothold was Macmillan, which Maxwell had taken over a few years prior. But a lot of these takeovers and acquisitions that Maxwell was doing in the 1980s weren't so much being directed and planned out by Maxwell, but actually by Rothschild Inc. And this is in the New York Times of all places, because the Rothschild Inc. is like the Rothschild banking family's presence on Wall Street. And they ignored it for a time until I think the early 80s when they put a guy named Robert Peary in charge of it, and they wanted him to build it up and make it more powerful and important. And so they decided to focus specifically on mergers and acquisitions, and they used Robert Maxwell and Jimmy Goldsmith as sort of their I don't know, sort of like as chess pieces to develop their bank on Wall Street. And one of those was like Maxwell taking over Macmillan. That was totally designed by Rothschild Inc. and Robert Peary, which is pretty crazy to think about, all things considered. So, he's basically not even directing at least some of his own major business decisions. It's being directed by this particular bank, which is interesting when you consider the history of the Rothschild family in the state of Israel, because of course, at this point in time, Maxwell had been on the Israeli intelligence payroll since 1961, over 20 years. And Jimmy Goldsmith being in that particular group as well is very significant because Jeffrey Epstein was seen hanging out at his house as early as the 1971. when he was in college age.
Hey guys, real quick, I want to tell you about our boy James McMahon and Copy My Crypto. Let me tell you about copymycrypto.com. Listen, so many people are making real member allows you one call. I want to get into Jeffrey Epstein, but real quick before we get that, because you brought up your volume 1 of your book, and I think this is very important because I think, like I'm in the conspiracy side of a lot of stuff. I believe power conspires all the time, and that's kind of. But within the conspiracy community, there is this real belief that only the left, the Democrats, and all these groups are into the pedophile stuff, and I'm constantly telling them that there was a boy hooker scandal.
The Franklin scandal.
The Franklin scandal in the White House. We've seen it happen before. So the question to you is, to those who think that pedophilia, because that's what it's being portrayed in the media and in social media, that this is a left-wing thing, not a right-wing thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess before, the Clintons, the big pedophilia scandals in terms of proximity to political power were things like the Franklin scandal, which involved Bush Sr. and the Reagan administration, obviously Republicans, and more importantly, Republicans deeply tied to intelligence and organized crime, specifically Reagan on the organized crime connection stuff. And even before that, a lot of the big sex blackmailers in Washington, like I note in my book, were people like Robert Keith Gray, who worked on Reagan's 1980 campaign and was a big lobbyist and PR guy on Capitol Hill. And he was also a Republican and worked in the Nixon administration and stuff. Bill Casey was allegedly in a pedophile himself, according to the reporting of Nick Bryant and some of his sources. And of course, Bill Casey was a Republican CIA director under Reagan, head of the SEC under Nixon, and a longtime, veteran of intelligence stuff. And then you have people like Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's mentor, involved in pedophile, sex blackmail stuff that involved people like J. Edgar Hoover, the conservative leaning head of the FBI for decades and decades and decades. So this is definitely not exclusive to the left. And I think that rhetoric's only really happened because you have a corrupt, quote unquote, left political dynasty like the Clintons, who are obviously involved in this kind of stuff. And a lot of the focus, as it relates to Epstein's sex crimes and and the connections of those crimes to powerful people, have focused a lot more on the Clintons and people that are viewed as being left-leaning than anyone else. And also another thing is that for the past several years, these types of issues only get talked about by right-leaning media. It's very hard to find any sort of mainstream left media complaining about pedophiles at all, ever. So.
And not only
there's
not
mainstream media.
Actually, not even just not complain about, but
saying if you call someone a groomer, it's a slur.
Yeah.
But groomer is a very specific term for what pedophiles do. So you can't say it's a slur. It is a specific term. So, and then there's this whole effort in some circles, the minor attracted persons. We shouldn't call them pedos, we should call them MAPs and all of the stuff, and changing the rhetoric around it, which is really silly. That's ostensibly coming from left-leaning stuff, but ultimately I think some of the talking points today miss the point, and that they're trying to feed more the culture war and not the fact that this is a left-right issue, and that our political system's been totally corrupted and destroyed because they like to put people into power that they know they can compromise with little boys and little girls.
Yes. Well, that is 100% it. It is the ritual to the highest levels of power. In gangs, they do jump-ins. They do, hey, you gotta go kill somebody, so we have something on you. And before it used to be oh, you cheated on your wife, we have blackmail on you, back when that was seen as the ultimate sin. Now, as we get more and more liberal, now people don't care about, let's say, if you're gay. a lot of people don't care. So now it's like at the heart of it is pedophilia, and that is the initiation to the highest levels of power. So I want to get into Jeffrey Epstein, and this might have been asked this before, but it's like it's very interesting. Why Epstein, and why Epstein so early? Because like there's just to me like everything is just even before they had our phones and they could collect our data. When you look back at the CIA and what the CIA and the FBI were doing in Haight-Ashbury with not just acid, but also crystal meth and these free clinics, which were just data gathering centers where they were
spy on people and experiment on them and stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So even before the internet, there must have been something that told the elites that Jeffrey Epstein was the guy that would be perfect for us to use as what was either the head of it or something under Ghislaine Maxwell, where they made him look like the leader, but it was really she was pulling the strings, whatever it was. What do you think it was about Jeffrey Epstein that made them go, this is the guy that's going to run this stuff?
Well, I think they were looking for specific personality traits, specifically when it comes to charisma, being able to schmooze powerful people, make them feel at ease, even though they're about to engage in illicit activity. I would probably put that skill set right at the top. As far as, when Epstein might have realized he was good at that sort of thing or been interested in these types of operations. So as far as him and the public team up with Ghislaine Maxwell, they arguably met long before this. But, that starts at like 1991. But about a decade prior, Epstein was associated with institutions like the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which was basically a private intelligence apparatus masquerading as a bank, and also Adnan Khashoggi. So Adnan Khashoggi had a yacht, right, which later, oddly enough, gets bought by Donald Trump. But before then, when it's Khashoggi's yacht, he basically has a harem of women that are used to blackmail politicians and also like CEOs of major corporations to benefit Adnan Khashoggi's, arms deals and the people he's managing. So you have, right there, someone doing this kind of stuff, and Epstein's already in that world. And then with BCCI, it's in the official U.S. Senate report on BCCI after it collapsed in 1991. They were trafficking underage girls to the elites of the United Arab Emirates. Some of them were pre-puberty. A lot of them suffered grave injuries because they were being pimped out. Oh. And the guy that founded BCCI, who's a Pakistani guy, was doing that. And he had a woman who was basically doing what Ghislaine Maxwell would later do for Epstein. It's the exact same operation. BCCI did it a while ago, and it was mainly for VIPs of the bank and VIPs of the United Arab Emirates that they were servicing.
So when you bring up Khashoggi, right, is this the quote unquote journalist that was chopped up? And
no, that's Jamal Khashoggi, who's the nephew of Adnan Khashoggi. So Adnan Khashoggi was a major arms dealer of Saudi origin, but he was tied up with pretty much every intelligence agency. So he was a major figure in Iran-Contra, for example. He was on the payroll of Mossad at that time. He was also working with the CIA. He had ties to the Safari Club, like French intelligence, Moroccan intelligence, Egypt, I mean, all over the place. Anyone willing to pay for his services, he would, willingly associate with. And he was an arms dealer at the end of the day. And so he's, a pretty notorious figure. Because of that, Jamal Khashoggi's his nephew. Jamal Khashoggi was actually embedded with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan when the CIA was arming them in the 1980s as part of Operation Cyclone, and was one of these sort of like CIA-friendly embedded journalists with the Mujahideen, which of course at that time included people like Osama bin Laden, right? And you have some other people in the same network that have surprising ties to Ghislaine Maxwell. For example, like Carlos Mavrolian, who's another one of these CIA-linked journalists embedded with the Mujahideen, who dies really suspiciously as soon as Al-Qaeda becomes the boogeyman at the end of the 90s and the lead up to 9/11. Dies a very suspicious death. He was pretty clearly murdered by Pakistani intelligence at the time.
Do you think same thing happened to Robert Maxwell? You think he was taken out?
Well, that's what Ghislaine Maxwell thinks. And wasn't she like the closest to him out of all his kids? She says it was a combination of Sicilian mafia contract hitmen and Mossad renegades. That's her claim. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of people don't really buy the official narrative that it was an accident and he just, was a fat guy that slipped off his boat and drowned, I mean, it's kind of hard to believe. And people like Gordon Thomas, who are pretty well regarded biographers of Maxwell, regarded as a homicide. And it would make the most sense, to be honest.
All right, guys, real quick, I want to tell you about our friends at Z Biotics. That's right, Z Biotics. Xavier, what?
It's pre-biotic that to get when you money pressure.
Bill Gates is sponsoring this at checkout for 50. Obviously, Bill Gates is, in the forefront of, he is the face of what everybody deems as like this kind of depopulation movement. I personally believe he's an actor in the role. His father was in charge of the Federal Reserve of Washington, and
Planned Parenthood.
And Planned Parenthood. So, just there's a lot of stuff that goes on that just is like, the same thing with Elon Musk, just like rich kid, position in power to pull out some stuff. But it's crazy how close he was with Epstein. And I know there's been discussions of this, but how deep was the connection?
Yeah, much more deeper than it's been described. So, I mean, if you believe the official narrative, or like if you believe Bill Gates, they just had dinner and that was it, right? And if you believe the official narrative from Gates and, even mainstream media sources, they didn't meet until 2011. As I note in the book and some of my articles that are online at my website, unlimitedhangout.com, you can read all about how that's total bullshit. And their ties at least go back to the 1990s, mid 1990s, potentially earlier. Because at that point in time, Bill Gates was a business partner of a company that involved Ghislaine Maxwell and both of her twin sisters called, they were responsible for the Magellan search engine. Their company was called the McKinley Group. And Isabel Maxwell was negotiating those deals with Microsoft in 1995. And then in the late 90s, Bill Gates and also Paul Allen, the other Microsoft co-founder, basically come in to rescue the IPO of her company ComTouch, which is all like ex-IDF guys. And Isabel Maxwell's in charge of it. And they hired her specifically because she was Robert Maxwell's daughter and could help them get a foot in the door in Silicon Valley when they didn't have they were drowning in debt. They were not a profitable company. They hardly had any clients. And it seems pretty clear it was an intelligence cutout from the off. And Bill Gates, according to Isabel Maxwell, put them on the map. And then in 2000, there's the weirdest freaking interview ever in The Guardian of Isabel Maxwell. And they ask her about Bill Gates. This is in 2000. And she starts purring. That's what the Guardian journalist says, purring and speaking in a fake Southern accent, like a Southern Belle accent. It's freaking insane when she's talking about Bill Gates. And then, Ghislaine Maxwell was invested in that company. Then you have people that were around Epstein in the mid 90s saying that he talked about Bill Gates pretty regularly. And the fact that he was flying on his plane was Bill Gates' top advisor and chief technology officer of Microsoft, Nathan Myhrvold. And then in, I think, 98 or so, Epstein was officially accompanied, like an official company Microsoft delegation to Russia. And there's pictures of him in this particular town that's around this nuclear site, taking pictures in front of people's houses, including with members of this particular nuclear facility. And if you look at that in the context of Epstein being Israeli intelligence and their longstanding interest in nuclear espionage, it becomes kind of interesting, I guess. But there's pictures of him at high schools in that particular Russian town, and that was taken with Microsoft Russia or their particular delegation there. And then you have this particular figure named Melanie Walker. So Melanie Walker was recruited to be a Victoria's Secret model for Epstein in 1992, but there's no evidence she actually modeled at all. But Epstein was apparently paying her and paying for her studies in graduate school, and she becomes his science advisor, I think, in either 96 or 98. And then after that, she gets hired by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And, this is like 2003, 2002. So if you're Bill Gates and you're going to hire a new science advisor and their resume, the job before was being Jeffrey Epstein's science advisor, and you hire them, it's because you know who Jeffrey Epstein is and what kind of science he's into. right?
It is really cool.
So, but here's the killer thing. So, the Evening Standard, which is UK mainstream media, in 2001 had an article introducing Epstein to the British audience because he was hanging around Prince Andrew. Yeah. And they say in there, and it's never been retracted, Jeffrey Epstein's wealth is because of his business links to three men: Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and Bill Gates. That's in 2001. So how did they not meet until 2011? And that's because they're trying to protect Microsoft more than just Bill Gates. Because in 2011, Bill Gates was not in charge of Microsoft anymore. So like I mentioned earlier, Epstein was doing this Microsoft Russia thing. He was tied up with Nathan Myhrvold. Nathan Myhrvold's been named by people like Virginia Roberts as actively involved in his sex crimes. And then you have other Microsoft executives in the mix, like Melanie Walker is basically pimped out by Epstein to Prince Andrew, and then shortly thereafter, she's essentially like married off to another top Microsoft executive named Steven Sinofsky, and then Linda Stone is another Microsoft executive that in the early 2000s is all tied up with Epstein and hires one of his like ex masseuses or something to be her secretary. And so there's a bunch of weird like Epstein Microsoft stuff going on, basically. So if you move it to 2011, you make the connection exclusively about Epstein and Bill Gates and about Bill Gates' philanthropies, not you take Microsoft totally out of the equation. And I think there's an obvious reason for that. Do you want a pedophile intelligence asset having undue influence over one of the biggest tech companies in the world that runs on government computers and all this stuff? I mean, it obviously opens up a major issue.
Now, I was going through some of your articles, and I found they're all super interesting, but one that really stuck out to me was about how the CIA and Mossad are exploiting mass shootings. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I wrote this after my original series in in 2019 for Mint Press. I was writing about some of these investments that Epstein had made with people like Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, who was very close to Epstein and pretty obviously involved in this sexual blackmail operation and the sex crimes on a pretty significant scale. And Ehud Barak was running and essentially had created a company called Carbine 9/11, and Epstein had put a bunch of money into the company. So did people like Peter Thiel. And Carbine's still around. They've taken a lot of the Israeli operatives and people tied to Epstein and Ehud Barak himself off of the company. But they're making major inroads in the United States and are about to basically be running all of the 911 call systems in the United States because they're moving to this new thing called Next Generation 911. So instead of having every 911 system be local, they want to centralize it. They want to make a nationwide interconnected system that's all running on like smartphones and 5G and all of this stuff. And that company is Carbine 911 because they've basically hired Michael Chertoff and Christian Nielsen or whatever, the DHS head under Trump, to their board of advisors and like a bunch of ex-cops and stuff like that. So this Israeli spy company that was made by like Israeli intelligence operatives and then had Epstein money and Ehud Barak, this is basically going to be installed, all over 911 systems. And the way Carbine works, as I note in the article, you call 911 and then they get access to your camera and your microphone for the call and also afterwards. And they can access all your data on your phone and like download it without your consent. Because you're just calling 911.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but I mean, you're just giving it all to Israel, basically. I mean, it's pretty insane, but that type of stuff doesn't raise any eyebrows in Washington. Like in 2020, I wrote a 3-part series about this Israeli Unit 8200 company called Cyber Reason, and they're running a bunch of software on our most like sensitive national security systems for like the Army and the Navy and stuff. And like, they're a foreign company. Why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense.
Now, have you ever looked into the, I know we got a short amount of time, so I want to get into other scandals, but there's other things I want to talk about. So, have you ever looked into the connection between the Vatican and Israel? Have you ever done any research into that?
Yeah, so unfortunately not. Like, I haven't really looked into the Vatican that much as far as research goes. I did talk about them kind of recently because the Pope heads up the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, which is like Lynn Forster to Rothschild and the head of MasterCard and all these like really unfortunate human beings with loads of money coming together under the Pope, and he's telling them how to make a more inclusive, quote unquote, economic system. I mean, it's really silly because it's all tied up with like the CBDC stuff and all this other, this new economic paradigm they're trying to get people to sleepwalk into, essentially. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of shady stuff with the Vatican going way back. If I'm not mistaken, stuff like Operation Gladio involved organized crime, the CIA and the Vatican and like, NATO and stuff. So they've obviously been willing to get dirty for a really long time. And then there's also the death of that Pope, I guess John Paul I, I think it was, who like died with a note in his hand, and then someone came back and the note was gone, and he was trying to investigate or like bring to heel the Vatican Bank right before he died and all the stuff. That's pretty shady.
It's crazy. It's crazy. I want to get into domestic terrorism and what that is. In Joe Biden's America, who is a domestic terrorist?
So, yeah, I wrote an article asking that exact question, and it was based off of policy documents from the Biden administration, specifically the Department of Justice, on basically the framework for the war on domestic terrorism, which I think they'll launch in earnest once they have their domestic terror 9/11 equivalent. I think that was intended to be January 6th, but like no one cares. And now there's a new poll that like 18% of Americans think January 6th was like all the feds, which it was, but it's like kind of funny that like, the American public actually was able to figure that one out because normally they don't, So as far as who it is based on this document, like if you just listen to the talking points, you'll just think it's just all far right people that are going to be, on the shit list for domestic terror. And no. It's anyone who's anti-authority, anti-government, opposes what is it, like the globalization of corporations or something, like increased corporate power, basically. I mean, it's literally going to be anyone on left and right that doesn't agree with the system. And it's basically saying, it also basically says in this policy document that Americans disagreeing with each other is a major driver of violence and we have to stop it. So basically we have to agree all the time, and we have to agree with what the state says all the time. That's pretty much in there. And it's really crazy because there's like contractors for misinformation working for the military right now. I've written about one called Primer AI. They're all ex-CIA people or ex-people that used to, do insurgency stuff, counterterrorism stuff after 9/11. So all those guys that were like hunting down insurgents in Iraq and whatever are now going to be hunting you. That's basically how this works. And the Primer AI guy, the head of it, wrote this article in 2020 where he says, 2020 is the year we will begin to weaponize the truth. And he basically calls for creating what he calls a Manhattan Project for Truth, where basically we remake the whole internet. And if you want to look up anything, you basically have to use a Wikipedia equivalent that's populated with data from the CIA. So the CIA will tell you what's true and what's not.
And I'm just waiting for them to try to recreate the internet. And
they're going to do it, yeah, because they really want to clamp down on anonymity online. So there's the financial anonymity stuff they want to get rid of, like Bitcoin, crypto, all of that stuff, and then online anonymity. They want you to have a digital ID tied to your internet activities, so they know what you're searching and doing online all the time. It's all tied to your ID. And they tried this under the Obama administration. They called it the driver's license for the internet. They've been pushing for it in the UK the past couple of years. And I think the EU is getting pretty far along on that particular point. But it's all part of the planned out, digital ID framework that in order to connect to the internet, you will have to tie your digital ID to your internet access. So, I've done a lot of work on this particular group called the World Economic Forum Partnership Against Cybercrime. It's one of these public-private partnerships within the WEF, and it's run by an ex-top Israeli spy guy named Tal Goldstein. that created this crazy cybersecurity policy for Netanyahu, which was basically like, operations that Mossad used to do in house, we're now going to make all these front companies for. So like Israeli tech companies made by Unit 8200 alumni, we're basically going to use those to conduct all of our intelligence operations. It was like a very open.
It's
thing.
so
It's
deep.
pretty crazy.
It's so deep. It's so deep. Now, do you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about this particular topic, but sorry, I know you want to talk about more stuff. So.
Yeah, it's really crazy. So we keep. I just watched some economic forum thing, and this guy's like, just like they said before 9/11, where they needed like a Pearl Harbor type event. This guy's openly talking about we're going to need another high impact event to shock the system.
He's saying it's going to be a cyber attack in the next 2 years. That's what the head of the WEF is saying. Not Klaus Schwab, the other guy that manages it for him. I forget his name. It's like Jurgen something. But yeah, he was basically saying like there's going to be this big cyber attack. And if you look at the WEF Partnership Against Cybercrime policy documents, which by the way, this partnership against cybercrime, it's all the big banks. It's like Wall Street. Yeah. And then it's the FBI, the DOJ, Israel's National Cyber Directorate, and then the UK National Crime Agency. So it's Israel, the US, and the UK. And they basically say that there's going to be a massive attack on the financial system, and it's going to be a ransomware attack. That's how they're going to destroy Bitcoin, I think, is by having a big ransomware false flag. And they'll be like, oh, the only way we can stop these ransomware attacks from happening, because the ransomware stuff, they always want the ransom paid in Bitcoin, right? We have to make Bitcoin illegal, because otherwise they're going to keep asking for Bitcoin and ransom. We have to keep people from being able to cash out and use Bitcoin as money. So that's part of it. But if you look at the, how they want to end financial anonymity and online anonymity in one go, how do you do that? By having a massive cyber attack that takes down the financial system and the internet. And then in order to get people back onto the internet, so they'll know they'll keep the internet safe, you have to have an ID. We have to get serious on cybercrime. So that means government issued ID to access the internet, so we can know what you're doing all the time and make sure you're not doing anything you're not supposed to be doing, right? And then getting rid of financial anonymity, meaning that we can track all your financial transactions, which is the central bank digital currency. So, they've already set it up. I'm going to be doing a video probably next week or this week about that partnership against cybercrime specifically, because they've laid it all out. And the biggest Wall Street banks in the US totally on board, because they have to collapse the system in a way that they can do it that's like a controlled demolition that they can like handle, and then rebuild a system that's favorable to them but not to us. And they've already designed it, right? The central bank digital currency stuff and the digital ID system are meant to interface together, and it's actively being developed right now by central banks. Wall Street's on board, and pretty much every national government's on board with it. So they have to have some sort of way to force people onto that. But if you think, oh yeah, well, I'll just do it this once, get the digital ID, whatever, so I can get online again and still talk to people. The internet after this event is not going to be the same as the internet now at all. It's not like that creativity we talked about, the chaos of the current internet. It's going to be gone. It's going to be like the most bland crap, because no one can say anything funny, because it's going to be like illegal. They're going to know who you are. They're going to be like watching everything you type and say and watch and read. So who's really going to be expressing themselves or making like, edgy content anymore? Nobody. It's just going to be crap. So I would say stay away from the Trojan horse,
Is there a counter? There's always a counter. Do you think there'll be a counter? There's always some autistic kid somewhere comes up with something that counters this stuff. Because I know when I was in China, they'll be like, dude, they censor the internet here. They're like, just get a VPN, you'll be fine. Do you see any of that possibly happening?
Yeah, it depends. So as far as I understand, most of the modern internet only really depends on like 13 or something servers internationally that like manage almost all of it. You take those 13 out, or you control who runs them. You control the modern internet. So, it really depends on how far they plan to go with this. ultimately, I think it's possible to rebuild a parallel internet system, which are just basically interconnected computers, right? I mean, I think it's possible, but do most people have, the know-how of how to set that up, or are they actively setting it up? I don't really see it. But what I would say is that, it's really important right now to save content that you like or you think you will need in the future offline right now. So like if you don't know crap about like growing your own food, for example, or, other types of skills about how to make your own stuff, and like, they're going to try and collapse the economy and you're going to need to know those things. You don't have to learn it right now if you don't have time, but at least like save a bunch of YouTube tutorials or something about how to do it somewhere so you can access it when you need it. Right. And the same thing too for like, world events. Think about how much information, news stories, videos, news broadcasts about 9/11 have been totally like deleted in the past 20 years. You can't find them anymore. I mean, almost all of it, probably the vast majority. So they delete stuff all the time. So, you could really make a case that everything should be saved offline to an extent.
I save everything. But my question to you is because, and this is my honest belief, I used to have things saved on my computer, like in files, right? Like inside files. And then one day I would go in there and the audio was all gone on these videos. And
you got to save it in hard drives and you got to put them in Faraday bags, which you can buy on Amazon.
But I 100% believe that somebody, because of the show I do, went in there and jacked the audio off that.
It's totally possible. So going back to Ehud Barak, right? Ehud Barak with a bunch of other ex-IDF guys created another company at the same time he was making Carbine 9/11. Well, I think it was a couple of years later, called Toka. And Toka basically claims to be able to hack and manipulate any device without the user knowing. And they're marketing it all over the world. I mean, this Israeli spy tech and also the CIA stuff. I mean, like when WikiLeaks put out Vault 7 and stuff, they were like, we're doing this because the CIA's hacking unit is totally out of hand, and all of these tools to get in and manipulate everyone's stuff have just like fallen out in the dark web, and now everyone has it. So like anyone can mess with your stuff, intelligence agency or like, anyone with the technical know-how. I mean, it would be kind of naive to think that no one can get into your stuff unless you're taking like extreme protections.
This isn't down your rabbit hole, but do you think this has to do anything with the Mandela effect, or why it's messing with us, where they're deleting the internet and in a way we believe we didn't save it and we should have saved it?
Like,
I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, I think if you see it online and you think it's useful to you, try and get in the habit of saving it all offline if you can. I don't know, how much of it's like psychological of thinking like, oh, they might have deleted my stuff, or maybe I didn't save it. Is that what you're asking?
Well, what we've talked about on this show before is that there's kind of this push to get you to not believe your eyes, your ears, or your experience.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So what they kind of do, and I mean, this is like going back to kind of what you just said, which is that, who knows what programs they have. So could they go back and they have a program that can find the video anywhere on the internet, anywhere, and just re-upload it in a way that makes us go, oh, I remember Britney Spears' skirt being plaid. What do you mean it's black now? So, I mean, it's possible. All of it's possible.
Yeah, well, I think the internet, specifically social media, is just like one giant psyop at this point. Like social media is there to influence you in your perception of what you think and how you perceive how other people are thinking and feeling. Right. And it's pretty much openly admitted, like the military, DARPA specifically, has plunged like so much money into studying social media for the past 20 years. And there's a headline, I think it was on Ars Technica, about how the one branch of the military was trying to find out how they can use social media to control human beings like they control drones. That was the headline. So social media, and if you consider that most social media companies from the time they were created had major national security ties, like with Facebook and DARPA or Google and the CIA, and all of that. I mean, it's a pretty convincing case that this is just a major tool for them to manipulate how we perceive the world and ourselves and world events. And there's been stuff, stuff has come out over the years, like Facebook's manipulating people's news feed to make them like feel a certain way, manipulate their emotions and all of that. I mean, they're doing it to us all the time. And we look at a lot of stuff on social media and think it's real, but like even Elon Musk didn't want to buy Twitter because of how many bots are on there. I mean, we don't know how many bots are actually on there, right? Totally agree. And how sure are you that the person you're interacting with is even real? And they want to just disconnect us so much from reality. I mean, that's like what the metaverse is all about. Like you can date someone in the metaverse and they look a certain way, but it's not totally connected to who they are in real life, and you're not supposed to care. It's all, a new reality and all this stuff. I mean, it's just all totally insane how things are. But like to me today, social media is just all about manipulating people psychologically and making them, like you said, unable to believe, being divorced from what their intuition and their five senses tell them, and critical thinking tells them. So, and you need that to manipulate people at the scale that we're seeing.
So you're talking about this internet event. Do you and the collapse of the finance? Would you tell people to get their money out of banks? And my question, because I get told this by good friends of mine who I love, where do I put my money? If I'm pulling it out, like, should I invest into a house and hope to God that they lose the fucking deed? So I paid you off, bro. I paid you off.
Well, I would definitely get your money out of the big Wall Street banks. Like if you're banking with like Bank of America,
or Chase,
Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase. Yeah, I mean, you're screwed. You will be screwed. Santander, is another one. I don't know if they're active in the U.S., but they are in Britain and some other places. They're a Spanish bank, and Deutsche Bank has long been pegged as sort of one of the first banks that's going to totally collapse in this next financial crisis because of how screwed they are fiscally. So you have them, Santander, and then a bunch of the big Wall Street banks. I'm not a financial expert, but I would say it would make sense to if you want the regular banking experience and you don't want to use those banks, look for smaller banks, community banks, or like co-ops and stuff, and try and put your money there. Or look at how, a particular bank fared during the 2008 crisis. Did they have to be bailed out? Did they lose everyone's money? Were they super irresponsible then? Because they'll probably be irresponsible now. If they weren't in 2008, you have a better shot. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what you have to care about, right, is like, how am I going to feed myself and my family and like make sure we can meet our basic needs if the world gets totally insane? And so whatever money of yours you can put in that makes sense. Right.
Now, I know you're not a financial expert, but your feel, do you think it is better to buy gold and silver instead of holding on to regular fractional reserve banking cash?
I mean, possibly, but like what I was just saying. So like, for example, if you have a certain amount of money and you're not sure what to do with it, put it in gold, put it in silver. Like, is it enough to also put in something that's going to keep you and your family fed and like safe during a financial crisis, like a major economic collapse where like society breaks down and goes totally haywire? Like, so for me, I had some money from the book, right? And so I bought like 2 acres somewhere and a little dinky house on it. I'm going to try and farm, right? So we can feed ourselves if stuff gets really crazy. So, I could have put all that money in gold. I could have put all that money in silver, but you can't eat gold and silver at the end of the day, totally right? You can't eat Bitcoin either. So I don't really know, what it looks like for some people. Like some people, don't want to take that step or whatever, or, maybe Bitcoin or something is part of their way in getting to like, your little lot of land somewhere. If that's how it is for you, cool. If not, cool too. I'm not trying to tell people like what to buy and what to put their money in, but people should start seriously really thinking about like, what would you do if the internet wasn't around tomorrow? Like, how would you feed yourself? If the economy collapses, what would you do? And what kind of stuff like would you like to have on hand? Maybe put some of your money in buying that stuff, like a water filter or, mini indoor greenhouse. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. It just depends on like you. It's very particular to the person. And like, do you live alone? Do you have a family? What kind of area do you live in? Blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, and it's not like a one size fits all type of thing, but I think people need to really start seriously thinking about how to sort of get more have more independence from the system, right? Because if the system is going to collapse and the way they're going to try and hurt us into this new system is our dependence on the current system and the fact that so many people are basically slaves to convenience. They'll do anything for like comfort and convenience. Right. I mean, that's basically how the smartphone wiggled its way into our lives, right? Oh, look, this is so convenient to have it on a phone. And then the next step is, oh, look, it's so convenient to have Neuralink in my brain, which is basically a smartphone in the brain. And they're already like, you know, people promoting that stuff were already saying like, oh, it's just like the smartphone, you know, and all this other stuff that like, you know, we basically outsourced all of our needs and you know everything we need to consume to stay alive, you know, to corporations that want to enslave us. So if you don't want to be enslaved, you gotta get off the plantation, basically.
All right. I understand that, and you know, so you're bringing up cryptocurrency. Obviously, FTX was a huge story. That disappeared. That just completely disappeared
He's going to jail.
Is he?
That's what I heard.
He might. We'll see how much they try and throw him under the bus. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of really crazy stuff going on with the FTX thing. And if you ask me, SBF was just a puppet for somebody.
Yeah.
It looks like his handler was William McCaskill, the head of the Center for Effective Altruism that's tied up with the guys that funded Event 201, Open Philanthropy, which is a Facebook co-founder, teamed up with McCaskill. And McCaskill basically guided SBF's whole career from the time he was an undergrad until he, got arrested last year.
So you talk about this one particular farm, which is Farmington State Bank. What role did they have in it?
Yeah, so I looked at this particular bank mainly because there was just some really weird stuff going on with it. So FTX poured through Alameda Research, which was one of their sort of like subsidiaries, they poured a bunch of money into it, and then it underwent this very rapid change to become Moonstone Bank just a couple of days later, and they signed deals with a company run by the guy that claims to have invented central bank digital currency and all this stuff. And it's weird because this bank is like super small. I mean, if you look at it on Google Maps, I mean, it's like smaller than a trailer. It's like in a town of like 12 people. And it doesn't make any sense why they pour all this money into this bank. But all this weird financial activity was going on with it probably a few months before FTX like completely implodes. And the guy running it that had bought Farmington not long before then is a guy named Jean Chalopin, and he's a French guy, but he's also the head of this bank in the Bahamas called Deltec. And Deltec was where FTX did a bunch of their really suspect banking. So they had a bunch of accounts there and a bunch of different currencies, and a lot of weird stuff financially was going on with FTX and Deltec. So you have the guy that runs Deltec buying this other tiny bank in the middle of nowhere, and then Alameda Research is pouring all this money to FTX money into it and for ostensibly no reason. Oh, another thing weird that happens right after that money goes in is that Moonstone hires the ex-CEO of Revolut to run it all of a sudden. And Revolut is a financial app that was created by NGF Capital, and NGF Capital is Nicole Junkerman Capital, basically. And Nicole Junkerman is an Epstein associate who was on the board of Carbine 9/11, and she was involved in his sexual blackmail operation, helping him, Epstein, sexually blackmail 2 U.S. senators in 2002, right before in the lead up to voting on war with Iraq and stuff like that. So, what's she doing there? And then if you look at the person who owned that particular bank before Jean Chalopin, it's this guy named Archie Chan who ties in with all this weird network that was involved with the stuff going on at the Clinton White House and Mark Middleton and Epstein in the mid-90s. It's really crazy. So why is all this stuff going on? You know, I can't really make sense of it at this point, but obviously, like, there's a lot more going on with FTX than meets the eye. And I think a lot of this ultimately boils down to what FTX's ambitions ultimately were. So Sam Bankman-Fried, before FTX imploded, said on numerous occasions that he wanted to turn FTX into the everything app. Have you heard that before? Because Elon Musk, when he wanted to acquire Twitter, says, I want to turn Twitter into the everything app. Well, the everything app, what is that? It's basically your gateway between the digital ID and everything else, right? So whoever controls the everything app controls pretty much everyone's data, right? And if data is the new oil, whoever controls the everything app are the Rockefellers of the data era. Basically.
This is why I'm afraid of this verification thing, by the way, Sam.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Doesn't China have a WeChat or something like that where it's like an everything app?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the goal, to be financial, social media, all the stuff together. So FTX was coming at it like, oh, we're going to dominate the financial side and then add social media and all this other stuff to it. And Elon Musk is coming from it like, well, I've got the social media component and now I'm going to add a financial component and blah, 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 and make it the everything app. But the everything app is just, who's trying to be the data baron of the, the new world order, basically. And it's weird with Elon Musk too, because the people that own WeChat also own a huge chunk of Tesla and are like major advisors, very active advisors, and have a lot of influence over Tesla as a company. So that's interesting in the context of Musk's comments explicitly saying he wants to make Twitter a WeChat equivalent and an everything app. But anyway, SBF wanted to do that for FTX, turn it into an everything app. So I would say there's a couple different factions fighting over who gets to make the everything app. And maybe, it'll be like the way they've done US politics forever. You'll get two flavors of the everything app. You can have, the red app or the blue app, depending on which one you like better. But, they're still screwing you over at the end of the day.
So I know we got to let you go here in 3 minutes. We got a hard out. Final question. Black pill, white pill. Is there any white pill out there for you? Do you have any spiritual understanding? I mean, you have children. I have children. Our children are around the same age. Are we just leading these kids into slavery? Is there hope? Is there anything at the end where you could fight back? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there's hope, but I think there's also like a concerted effort to manipulate people into thinking there's no hope. And so I think social media, like I mentioned earlier, that being a huge ground for psyops is a big part of that, to make us feel hopeless. So the more you're looking at social media for like, are we going to win this thing or not? No, you should be looking in your local community and trying to change minds in the real world, probably more than you are online at this point, since online stuff is so manipulated. And I think, there's a lot of efforts to make us think that we're all alone and that a lot of people aren't seeing what we've been seeing. Right. So polls, for example, polls are there to make people think that the public thinks a certain way, but I don't think it's reflective most of the time of what the public actually thinks. Good example, 2016, right? Hillary Clinton's going to win. All the mainstream media, things said because of polls, 90% plus probability Clinton wins and she doesn't win. That was to discourage people from going to vote for the other candidate, in my opinion. And this stuff happens all the time. So like you have the UK government coming out right now with like their YouGov thing that's all tied up with intelligence and shady people, right? Saying 71% of people in the UK thought the COVID restrictions weren't strict enough in Britain, right? That's probably bullshit. But they want you to think, oh, well, the people that think that it was wrong and like all this stuff, bad stuff happened, they're a tiny minority. You're a tiny minority, and you affecting change is hopeless. They want to basically infect people with the hopelessness disease, and so I think the more you realize that you can't believe that kind of stuff when you're looking at it, the better off you will be. So I'd say I'm definitely probably more white pilled than black pilled, because I think once things get they probably have to get tougher before we get to this point, but once things get tough enough, I think enough people will come together and realize they don't want to live in this reality we're being pushed into. And ultimately, I think it comes down to mass non-compliance. There has to be some sort of red line that enough people are going to say, no, I'm not going to do that shit. And no, thank you. And I think it'll happen at a certain point, because basically the way they're trying to coax us into all this stuff is through our addiction to convenience. But I think, enough people want to preserve their humanity because this is ultimately what it's coming down to with like transhumanism stuff. I think enough people are going to be wanting to preserve what humanity is and preserve their humanity than, oh, how convenient to go that route, I don't know. I guess there's a lot of other stuff I could say about it, but I'll probably just leave it there.
All right. Well, we did it. We here we are at the end. I appreciate you coming on. I have a show with a very funny comedian named Brian Callen, and everyone has been begging us to get you on, and I'd love to set that up a little down the way so you could show him the way. He's very stubborn, but I'm excited for you to talk to him.
This might be the end of that show, by the way, because if she goes on there and really lays down the law, you guys will agree on everything.
If it dies, it dies. Okay, that's what we got to do. But Whitney, thank you for coming on again. Your website's Unlimited Hangout, and you can find it also on Rockfin as well. As always, a pleasure. You always knock it out of the park. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate you, and thanks for coming on. We'll talk to you soon.